So the next life we're reading is Patriarch Tikhon. Patriarch Tikhon was probably the greatest martyr of the Russian Church during the period of its persecution by the communists. As Patriarch of all Russia for 8 years, he was invested with tremendous power and consequent responsibility. During that period, he lived a selfless life, scarcely a free man, and in the end became another victim for the sake of his faith and the whole Russian Church. Patriarch Tikhon, born Vasily Ivanovich Belavin on the 19th of January 1865 in Toropets, Pskov gubernia, was the son of a local priest and spent the first years of his life in his native town. Toropets was reminiscent of Moscow because of the abundance of churches everywhere, all very old and some of beautiful architecture. Old Russian ways prevailed intact from the old days in that town, and that was understandable as the nearest railroad was more than 200 miles away. He was educated in the ecclesiastical seminary of Pskov, where he was considered modest, a good pupil, and very religious. Tall and fair, of gentle and engaging personality, his classmates loved him, but their love was ever tinged with respect because of his firm, although completely unaffected piety, his brilliant success in his studies, and his readiness to help his classmates in their homework. The other pupils used to ask his help with their lessons. The young Belavin apparently enjoyed helping them and did it cheerfully, with humorous words, although with serious mien. He would spend hours working with his classmates in groups and singly, explaining their lessons to them. At the age of 19, he entered the Ecclesiastical Academy of St. Petersburg, 1 year younger than it was customary for those entering the academy. The students at the academy loved the religious and tender-hearted young man from Pskov, and although giving nicknames was not customary at the academy, they called him the Patriarch. How prophetic this proved to be. The former students of the academy were reminded of it when, in 1917, he was elected Patriarch of all Russia, the first patriarch after 217 years of church administration by the Holy Synod. In 1888, Vasily Belavin graduated from the academy at the age of 23 and was appointed a teacher to the seminary of Pskov. In 1891, he took the vows of monkhood and was given the name of Tikhon. In 1898, when he was only 33 years old, he was ordained bishop, and a year later received the Aleutian Alaskan Diocese in North America. There again, the young bishop won general respect and love. He toiled tirelessly in the religious field in North America and did much for his diocese. The former members of his flock remember their archpastor and sincerely respect his memory. He himself mentioned this period as one which had broadened his religious and political outlook. He himself mentioned this period as one which had broadened his religious and political outlook, had given him the opportunity to get acquainted with new forms of human relations, and had prepared him for future spiritual ordeals. During his 7 years' stay in America, Bishop Tikhon visited Russia only once, when the Holy Synod invited him to take part in a summer session. At that time, the spiritual and administrative talents of the young bishop were noticed by the highest hierarchs, as well as by the civilian administrators of the church. In recognition of his abilities, he was raised to the dignity of Archbishop in 1905, and in 1907 was appointed to one of the oldest and most important dioceses in Russia, the Diocese of Yaroslavl.
There's another thing that is important to note here, that one time he went to the Holy Synod, he brought with him a proposal to organize the North American Diocese, which at that point incorporated the whole of the North American continent, into multiple dioceses. And he had a proposal to elect 2 vicar bishops to serve with him. And the Holy Synod approved that proposal, elevated him to the rank of Archbishop, ordained one of the candidates as a vicar bishop, and then the St. Tikhon and the other bishop returned to New York, which is where he had moved his see from San Francisco, and they ordained the third or the second vicar bishop in New York City. So that was the first ordination of a bishop that took place in America.
In Yaroslavl, he won the hearts of everyone. Everyone came to love this accessible, intelligent, gracious archpastor who accepted all invitations to officiate in the numerous churches of that large diocese. The inhabitants of Yaroslavl felt they had an ideal archbishop and had no wish to part with him, but the highest authorities of the church soon transferred him to the Polish town of Vilno. The archbishop was still in Vilno at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. His diocese, being in the sphere of war activities, was partially cut off as the war front changed. The archbishop participated eagerly in all organizations which helped the soldiers and wounded. Visiting the sick and wounded, he often went to the front lines within the range of fire. For this he was decorated. During this period, he was frequently called by the government to be present at the Holy Synod. The revolution found Archbishop Tikhon in the Holy Synod. The new revolutionary chairman of the synod was very difficult to deal with, and before long all the members of the synod were replaced, Archbishop Tikhon being among them.
That took place before the Bolshevik Revolution. This is under Kerensky, and the Kerensky government, like the Soviets after him, were anti-church.
The people of Moscow were about to choose their archpastor at this time, and to his own great surprise, Archbishop Tikhon was elected. The city met him with great joy. The clergy as well as the people soon learned to like and respect him. 3 years later, on August 15, 1917, the Holy Council of Churches took place in Moscow, and Archbishop Tikhon was raised to the rank of Metropolitan and elected chairman of the council. In this council, specialists in ecclesiastical law and theology sat next to the common peasants. Many times the opinions of simple peasants were more popular than those of the men of science. One of the peasants said, "We no longer have a czar, no father whom we can love. It is impossible to love the synod. Therefore, we, the peasants, want a patriarch." In the meantime, Moscow was under an incessant gunfire, and the Kremlin had fallen into the hands of the communists. Hurriedly, the council proceeded with the election of a patriarch before the communists dissolved the council. It was decided to elect 3 candidates by general vote and then to cast lots, leaving the final decision to God's will. On October 28, a member of the council, a monk, was entrusted with drawing the lots, and he reverently drew out of the urn the name of the one chosen by God. The name announced by Vladimir, Metropolitan of Kiev, was Tikhon. Metropolitan Tikhon was neither eager to hear the results of the election, nor was he afraid. His humble submission to the will of God was quite apparent. When the delegates of the council, headed by the highest clergy, solemnly came to him to announce the good tidings of God's choice and to congratulate him, Metropolitan Tikhon said, "Your tidings announcing my election are to me like the roll of a book which Ezekiel had to eat, wherein lamentations, mourning, and woe are spoken of. It is my fate to be patriarch in these hard times and to shed many tears. Like the ancient leader of the Hebrew people, I shall also be calling to God, exclaiming, 'Wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? And wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all these people upon me? Have I conceived all these people? Have I begotten them, that thou shouldest say unto me, carry them in thy bosom, as a nursing father beareth the suckling child? I am not able to bear all this burden alone, because it is too heavy for me. From now on my duty shall be to take care of all the churches of Russia, and to die for their sake every day. But let God's will be done. I find my strength in the consciousness that I did not seek this election. It came to me not by the will of men, but by the will of God. I hope that he who himself called upon me will help me with his omnipotent blessings." Before his ascension to the patriarchal throne, Metropolitan Tikhon spent some time in the Troitsky Sergeyev Lavra preparing himself to receive the high office. A committee appointed by the council hurriedly worked out the details of the long-forgotten procedure for the consecration of a patriarch, particulars of the rituals, and the distinctive characteristics of the vestments. The communists had not yet closed the Kremlin, and it was possible to perform the ceremony in the ancient patriarchal cathedral of the Assumption, where the patriarch's throne still remained on the high place. No one had sat on that throne since the last patriarch 217 years before. Old patriarchal vestments were taken out from the rich collection of the attire of the patriarchs: the mace of Metropolitan Peter, the mitre and white hood of Patriarch Nikon. The great church celebration took place in the Cathedral of the Dormition on the 21st of November 1917. The bell called Ivan the Great sounded mightily. Crowds of people who filled the Kremlin and the Red Square near it raised a great din. Religious processions from all the churches of Moscow gathered on the Red Square. Metropolitan Tikhon, in his patriarchal vestments, was led to his throne. After the liturgy, the new patriarch went around the Kremlin, heading a religious procession carrying icons, church banners, and sprinkling holy water. The communists, not yet masters of the country, took no definite stand against the church, although their hostile attitude was obvious. The Red soldiers stationed at the guardhouse near the cathedral behaved defiantly, showing no respect to the icons and banners as they passed, but smoked, talked loudly among themselves, and laughed irreverently. But when the patriarch appeared, looking like a bent old man under the weight of his round white hood with the cross on top, and in the dark blue velvet cloak of Patriarch Tikhon, the Red soldiers immediately removed their hats, sprang towards the patriarch, and extended their hands over the railing of the guardhouse for his blessing. It was apparent that their outer show of defiance was nothing but an assumed role. As head of all the Russian hierarchs, Patriarch Tikhon never changed, but remained the same simple, gentle, and easily accessible man he had always been. But his gentle manner with people became firm when necessary, especially when defending the church against its enemies. It was evident to everyone that communists would interfere with the work of the church council and might even dissolve it. The patriarch did not ignore the antagonistic stance of the communists towards the church, the decrees destroying its foundations, or the cruelty of their acts. In his epistle describing the persecutions directed against the truth of Christ and the brutal killing of innocent people without trial, scorning all the laws of justice, the patriarch said, "Recover your senses, madmen. Bring to an end your bloody strife. You are not merely committing cruel deeds, but truly the deeds of Satan, which are condemning you to the flames of Gehenna in the next world, and leave a dreadful curse upon your descendants in the present one. By the power bestowed upon us by God, we forbid you to approach the sacrament. We anathematize you, if you have still kept your Christian names and belong, even only by birth, to the Russian Orthodox Church. We urge all true children of Christ's Church to keep away from such monsters of the human species. Put away the wicked man from amongst yourselves, 1 Corinthians 5:13. The enemies of the church are trying to gain power over it and seize its property by the force of guns. Resist them with the strength of your faith and join your voices in a powerful clamor of protest arising from the whole nation. If we must suffer martyrdom for the sake of Christ's church, we are calling upon you, beloved children of the true church, to bear this martyrdom together with us." This is from the epistle of January 19, 1918. In an epistle to the Soviet of the People's Commissars, on the occasion of the first anniversary of the October Revolution, Patriarch Tikhon wrote, "While you were seizing the power, you asked the people to trust you and made promises to them. But have those promises been fulfilled? You gave a stone instead of a loaf and a serpent instead of fish. You have substituted a soulless international concept for our motherland. You have divided the people into enemy camps and plunged them into a fratricidal war of an unprecedented cruelty. You have openly replaced Christ's love by hatred. You have not brought peace. You have incited class hatred. There seems to be no end in sight to the war instigated by you, because with the hands of Russian workers and peasants, you are trying to bring about the triumph of a phantom world revolution. No one feels safe under your regime, where there reigns a constant fear of search, robbery, arrests, and exile or execution. You promised freedom, but there can hardly be anything more painful and cruel than violation of religious freedom. The press is blasphemous and full of malicious ridiculing of sacred things. You have stolen church property collected by generations of faithful believers. You have closed many monasteries and house chapels. You have barred the entrance to the Moscow Kremlin, the sacred inheritance of all pious Russians. We know that our accusations will anger you and cause severe reprisals, that you will use our words as a pretext to accuse us of resisting your government. But the greater your anger and punitive acts, the more the truth of our accusations will be confirmed. Mark the anniversary of your rule by liberating those imprisoned by you, by ceasing bloodshed, violence, destruction, and oppression of religion. Otherwise, all righteous blood shed by you shall be required of you. Luke 11:51, and you that take the sword shall perish by the sword, Matthew 26:52. It's from the epistle of 26 October 1918. Many religious processions were organized in order to sustain the faith of the population, and the Patriarch always took part in them. When the shocking news of the murder of the emperor and his family was received by the Patriarch, he immediately performed the requiem. Later, he officiated at the liturgy for the repose of their souls. He accused the communists in a speech of an unjustifiable crime, since the Tsar had already abdicated the throne, a crime which branded the communists as murderers. It is not enough only to think it, added the Patriarch. One should not be afraid to say it in public, regardless of threats of oppressions. Everyone was worried about the Patriarch's safety. He was advised to leave Moscow, even to go abroad, but he refused. When friends informed him that the communists had decided to arrest him, he still told them that he would not leave. The flight of the Patriarch, he said, would cause the enemies of the church to rejoice, and they would use it for their own evil purposes. All the Moscow population was very concerned about the Patriarch. Parish communities organized a constant watch, and members of the church council took turns in staying overnight at the monastery, and every night without fail, the Patriarch would come out to talk with them. No one knew what these bodyguards could or would do if the communists attempted to arrest the Patriarch. But these faithful followers found spiritual consolation in remaining nearby, and the Patriarch, conscious of this loyal devotion, raised no objection. Fearlessly, the Patriarch visited churches in Moscow and elsewhere whenever he was invited to officiate. The people would stop in reverence and take off their hats. In Bogorodsk, an industrial town of the Moscow administrative area, the workmen met the Patriarch the way they used to meet the Tsar. A pavilion was beautifully decorated in his honor, and crowds filled the streets. In Yaroslavl, even after its devastation, the communists were forced to take part in welcoming the Patriarch, to dine with him and be photographed. The Patriarch's triumphant trips to Petrograd are well known. The religiousness of the Russian people had found an outlet, for in their hearts they felt in the Patriarch one of their kind, loving them and remaining faithful to them with his whole being. They found in the Patriarch their only spiritual support, consolation and hope. Their traditional father, the Tsar, had been taken from them, and in the Patriarch they had acquired a spiritual father with whom they had the strong inward ties of one faith and belonging to the Russian Church. In this, the people displayed the united force of the Church in the face of the enemy. Meanwhile, persecutions of the Church continued with increased vigor. Church treasures were stolen and clergymen were murdered in great numbers. According to one source of information, in the province of Kharkov alone, 70 clergymen were killed within 6 months, from the end of December 1918 to June 1919. News of such horrors reached the Patriarch from all over Russia. However, the communists had not harmed the Patriarch as yet. It is reported that Lenin said, "We are not going to make a second Yermogin out of him." At the beginning, the communists tried to negotiate with the Patriarch. Their aim was to demoralize him by sustained oppression of the Church and the murder of its servants. They promised to stop if the Patriarch would make concessions. Being natural enemies of all religion in general, and of the Church in particular, the communists assumed that the servants of the Church were their enemies. They therefore accused all clergymen of counter-revolutionary activities. They made no effort to find proof for such accusations and murdered priests everywhere. In order to save thousands of innocent lives and to improve the general situation of the Church, the Patriarch prepared to safeguard the Church's servants from any political demonstrations. On September 25, 1919, at the height of the Civil War, he ordered the clergy to cease all political strife with the communists. But his attempts to pacify the communists by such action were useless, for political accusations were only a screen to justify the liquidation of the clergy as servants of religion. The Patriarch openly renounced all political activity. By the decree of December 27, 1921, the communists ordered confiscation of church valuables under the pretext of raising means to feed the starving population. The Patriarch then issued an appeal of exceptional forcefulness both in thought and feeling, addressing all the Russian people and the whole world, and blessing the voluntary donations of valuables. He also recommended that the donors control the use of the funds. But the communists, of course, refused these conditions. Enforced requisition and open plunder of the churches caused general indignation among the people. The Patriarch was right in his proposition and appeal, but the communists were seeking an excuse to further terrorize the church. Some 2,000 trials and about 10,000 executions of the faithful occurred in connection with the requisition of the valuables. In May 1922, during the trial of a group of Moscow clergymen, the Patriarch, having to prevent their capital punishment, tried to compromise with the communists over the matter of anti-communist agitation by church movements outside Russian borders. The communists, however, repudiated the compromise and a few days later sentenced the clergyman to death and arrested the Patriarch himself. Immediately after his arrest, the communists organized a new church administration, the so-called Renovators. Although there was a lawful successor to the Patriarch, Metropolitan Agafangel, who stated his rights, the communists supported the Renovators, helping them to succeed and repressing the adherents of Patriarch Tikhon, Tikhonovtsi, which I'm guessing means Tikhonites. The Renovators were to control the church as the communists wanted. The Renovators' Council declared the Patriarch deposed, recognized the righteousness of the revolution, proclaimed as counter-revolutionaries the clergy who suffered from the communists, thus justifying the persecution of the church. They even announced that never before had the church been as free as it now was under the communist rule. The Renovators took over the church administration and the cathedrals of all the dioceses in spite of disapproval of the people and the majority of the clergy. The communists intended to hold a court trial of the Patriarch, but internal and external political considerations forced them to offer him freedom on the condition that he would give the authorities a written declaration of penance, acknowledging the truth of all their accusations of him. The Patriarch made this sacrifice, accepting in such a way real martyrdom. The Patriarch later said that, reading the newspaper in his prison, he was more and more terrified each day of the thought that the Renovators had usurped the Russian Church. That if he had known the truth of the people's opposition to it and the failure of the Renovators in their efforts, he would never have left the prison. But in prison it was impossible to know the truth, and the newspaper's propaganda favouring the Renovators was purposely given to him by the jailers. He believed that at last there existed some kind of order after revolutionary chaos. It seemed to him that a stable government had come into power for which he could afford to repudiate his former course of action. This had led him to say, "Let my name be ruined in historical annals as long as the church profits by it." The people did not doubt him, were not deceived by his action, but understood the true value of his sacrifice. They rejoiced over his liberation from prison and made it a glorious thing. His release encouraged the weak and the wavering among laymen, clergy, and bishops who rejoined the Russian Church. Every Sunday and holiday, the Patriarch officiated at the church services in Moscow and nearby towns, and the churches were packed with people. In country towns, the gathering of people was immense. The comings and goings of the Patriarch was triumphal. Working people left their work, and all the administrative and industrial institutions stopped functioning during the Patriarch's stay in towns. Open persecution of the Patriarch by communists ceased, but he was surrounded by spies and his every step was watched. The people, being afraid that the communists would secretly take him away, were always present in groups at his residence, never letting him out of their sight. Once the pious population of Moscow was greatly excited by rumors of the Patriarch's murder. Then it turned out to be false. When it turned out to be false, the joy of Moscow was great. On December 9, 1923, two persons entered the Patriarch's chambers, killed the lay brother Yakov Polozov, faithful and inseparable attendant of the Patriarch, and got away with 2 winter coats. Everyone was sure that the purpose of the crime was not robbery, and that if the Patriarch had happened to be in the room, he would have been killed. This was not the first case of communists' attempt to get rid of the servant of God. Jacob Polozov was buried in the Donskoy monastery, which was the residence of the Patriarch, where so many people came to bid him the last respects that the immense church could not hold half of them. The Patriarch himself, with tears in his eyes, officiated the services. The ever-increasing popularity of the Patriarch alarmed the communists, who invented new excuses to discredit him, that he too might be, quote, removed. According to the communist agency Rost, Hidden church treasures were found in the cellars of Kievo-Pechersk Lavra Monastery, buried by the monks during the requisition of church valuables in 1921. The communist press accused the Patriarch of having given orders for the concealment of these treasures. It also claimed that correspondence found there showed this connection with Russian refugees, showed a well-organized political agency, and showed political information to have been passed to the emigres. The press requested the immediate arrest of Patriarch Tikhon. In a letter of January 10, 1925, the Patriarch denied the accusations. The persecution of the church and the clergy was then renewed with increased cruelty. The communist tactics changed, however, and consisted in leaving alone the popular Patriarch, so well known and loved by the people all over the world, and depriving him of all contact with his friends. His assistants and followers were arrested and exiled. The communists did not dare to counteract openly the Patriarch's activities aimed at strengthening and safeguarding the Russian Church, but by means of innumerable obstacles prevented his orders from being carried out. Neither did they refrain from ordering arrests and further repressions when they deemed it necessary in order to nip church reorganizations in the bud. Regarding his position, the Patriarch used to say, "It would be easier for me to stay in prison. I am supposed to be free, but actually I can do nothing. I appoint a bishop to the south and he gets to the north. I send one to the west and they take him to the east." In this way, the Cheka prevented the bishops from reaching their destination and sent them to places of exile or imprisonment. The methods of the communists should be the subject of a special work. We can affirm here that those methods are diabolic. A special agent carried on a constant battle with the Patriarch. He visited him 2 or 3 times a week, trying to persuade the Patriarch to agree to certain actions harmful to the church, but advantageous to the godless rulers. What the communists could not accomplish through the renovators, they tried to do through the Patriarch himself. They kept up an incessant barrage of lies, deceit, and slander about the Patriarch, sowing seeds of distrust and discord. They strove to split the unity of the church. The Patriarch was continually obliged to discern the secret evil intentions underlying apparently reasonable propositions of the communists. Their method was to make promises or to threaten the church, not the Patriarch himself, for he was impervious. Sometimes they would promise to stop arrests of the clergy, to release prisoners, or to return from exile the able bishops of the church, or they would promise permission to print religious literature, allow freedom of meetings and religious education. Then they would turn to threats of increased oppressions and persecutions. It would be impossible to tell how the Patriarch suffered at that time. This man of incredible calm trembled under the strain and apprehension of the arrival of the communist agent. The Most Holy Patriarch Tikhon did not disgrace the Russian martyrs, but became one of them himself through the fortitude of his own sufferings. For 7 years he endured daily torture, violence and derision, incessant struggle with the enemy for the sake of the church. The Patriarch exhausted all possibilities of reconciling the church and its followers to the civil government of the communists. He became a victim in the fullest sense of the word of the communist persecution of the church and its followers. He sacrificed himself, his good name, his reputation as a confessor of faith, and as an accuser of falsehood. He humbled himself when he changed his way of dealing with the communists, but he never fell. He humiliated himself to save others from humiliation. He did not spare himself in order to seek mercy for the pastors of the church, the people, and the church welfare. The people understood that his compromises with the communists were acts of love and humility and pitied him deeply, sincerely convinced of his saintliness. The last days of the earthly life of this saintly man were already approaching. On January 12, 1925, Patriarch Tikhon was entered as patient Belavin in a private hospital where he remained for almost 3 months. He was suffering from heart attacks, chronic inflammation of the kidneys, general sclerosis, and asthma. Although the doctors recommended complete rest, it was difficult to take his mind off his duties. From the very first day in the hospital, many visitors appeared in the reception room, some of them agents of the GPU to whom admission could not be refused. 3 weeks later, he began to receive visitors in his sick room. When the communist agent Tuchkov came to visit him, the Patriarch always asked everyone to leave the room. Once he said the agent offered him retirement from his duties and suggested that he go to the south for convalescence. The Patriarch answered, "I shall have plenty of time for rest. Now I have to work." As soon as his health improved a little, the Patriarch began to officiate at the services in the churches of Moscow. Although he used to return exhausted, he would answer the doctor's reproaches with, "It is necessary," knowing perfectly well that he was undermining his health and overtaxing his strength. He felt especially ill after returning to the hospital very late one evening from a long meeting of the synod. All his followers, in whose cooperation he could count most, had been removed from Moscow, and he felt forsaken by everyone. The Holy Patriarch Tikhon of Moscow and of all Russia died during the night following the Annunciation holiday. He had celebrated his last liturgy on Sunday, 2 days before. On the day of the Patriarch's funeral, the streets of Moscow were jammed. These were not groups of aging, pious women, but representatives of all classes, not only of Moscow, but of nearby villages, small towns, and cities. The crowd streamed towards Donskoy Monastery. The cathedral and the immense yards of the monastery were packed with people. The walls of the monastery, the turrets, roofs, and trees were filled with those who wanted to bid their last respects to the Patriarch. There were probably some 300,000 persons within the monastery walls, and perhaps even more on the streets and nearby squares. All the churches of Moscow rang their bells when the funeral procession started. The choir sang Eternal Memory, and the crowd began to sing with the choir. The people kept perfect order, no pressing or jostling. The body of the Patriarch was buried in one of the churches of the monastery. On his grave was placed an oak cross with the words, Tikhon, Holy Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia, March 25, 1925. Father Joseph, did you have any thoughts to share?
There's a couple of things. First, you read that Lenin had said, we won't make a second Hermogen of Tikhon. The idea is that the murder of the Patriarch is only a rallying point for the faithful. And the life you just read makes it very clear that St. Tikhon himself was extremely popular, even amongst some of the rank and file Soviets. So Lenin was very careful not to make a open frontal assault on St. Tikhon, because that would have undermined the Soviets themselves. They were still struggling to get complete power up until the end of the Civil War. And so they didn't dare openly attack him, which is why they allowed as much as they did. During the 1920s, of course, they did have that power, and they started pushing down and pressing in on him. The second thing I wanted to mention was the renovators, Metropolitan Sergius Staritskoy, Sergius of sorry memory, who signed the 1927 declaration that the joys and sorrows of the Soviet state were the joys and sorrows of the Russian Orthodox Church, himself had joined with the renovators. And it was only after the Soviets were unable to successfully replace the Russian Orthodox Church, and St. Tikhon in particular, with the Renovationist Church, that they withdrew support, and a number of the renovators started to come back to the Russian Orthodox Church and ask for readmission. And Sergius was one of those. The people around St. Tikhon advised against receiving him because he was not deemed by them to be trustworthy. St. Tikhon did make him do public penance in the center of the cathedral, and then he reestablished him as a metropolitan in the Russian Orthodox Church. The Renovationists also they're called Renovationists because they were wanting to rejuvenate or bring in changes to the church, such as the second marriage of clergy, marriage after ordination, the abolishing of fasts, the shortening of services, the ending of monasticism, things like that. All of this was rejected by the people who still had an Orthodox mindset, and they resisted these kinds of things, which again, their life was indicating that. the people were a lot more resistant to the changes the Soviets wanted to do than the intelligentsia were, most of whom, or many of whom, went over to the Soviets at some point, and ultimately ended up suffering because of it, because in fact, all of the old Bolsheviks got themselves executed under Stalin.
Father, do you know why it is that the intelligentsia didn't survive these temptations the way that the simple folk did?
Well, I mean, you see this everywhere. Intelligentsia, they are highly educated, or they may be well educated, maybe not necessarily highly educated. But invariably, the people who will call themselves intelligentsia believe in rationality. The mind is the important thing for them. And the church teaches us that the mind, just as the rest of our human nature, is fallen. And so the mind will not lead us to the truth of God. That is done only through faith. And much of the educationist world is just embedded in this world. They can't rise above it. If it's not apparent to the senses, then it doesn't exist. And faith, by its very nature, God by his very nature, is not a function or a product of creation. He is the creator who makes creation exist, but he himself is outside of it, and it is impossible to perceive him only through physical means.
One thing that really struck me in this life, Father, was the way that all of the Russian people rallied around their patriarch.
It's really not possible for us to fully understand the trauma that the people in 1914 and on in Russia were enduring. First with World War I, which continued even past the time that the Soviets took power in the October Revolution. They tried to negotiate with the German command to end the war, and the Germans made a bunch of demands that they were unwilling to agree to, and so then, having essentially withdrawn their troops and disarmed, the Germans were able to sweep into Ukraine, and at that point, Trotsky was sent to just sign off on he was the foreign minister for the Soviet government. He signed off on the capitulation, which was the German terms were just widely accepted. They did that simply to get the Germans to stop invading and taking over the country, because they were afraid that were the Germans to continue, then they themselves, the Soviets, would be pushed out. They would no longer be there, and they rightly figured that once the Germans leave, they can renege on whatever they promised and ultimately get it back. They were looking for a little bit longer term than just the immediate war. That's followed by the persecutions and the end of the rule of law that you were reading about in the life. And the Civil War. It's actually multiple civil wars. There were several wars that were going on between different groups. And in fact, the Soviets lost their war against the Poles. The Poles were able, I think it was in 1919, they were able to defeat the Red Army and push them out of Poland, which is why it stayed an independent country until 1939. And then all of that followed that. So the people they've seen that the Tsar has been removed. This is even before the murder of the Tsar. Like I said, they were still faithful. The masses were by and large still faithful, and they see the restoration of the Patriarch as being God sent to them. And yes, they treat him as their father because there is no other authority, and so they're going to protect that as best they can. And they were able to get away with doing that for quite a while. Though again, at the end of the life, you're reading that they were murdering and exiling everybody who would be close to St. Tikhon to isolate him, because their intent was, we can't kill him and make him a martyr, but we can keep him from any communications. We can override his and prevent his orders from taking place. And he writes about that, what's happening when he tries to send a bishop someplace. He gets sent essentially in the opposite direction, which also causes confusion in the church, because now you have a bishop who's ordained for one place and he's ending up in somebody else's diocese, and that would hopefully, from the Soviet standpoint, cause some friction. They did survive that, at least the church did. Ultimately, the patron saint of my church, Joseph of Petersburg, recognized that the only way that church administration is going to be able to survive, and the church is going to be able to survive, is to go back down underground into the catacombs and forget about a central administration. And Patriarch Tikhon himself did recognize this, because in 1920, in ukaz number 362, he basically told the bishops outside of Russia to organize themselves into administrative units where the senior bishop in that area could kind of form a whole another little synod that would regulate the life of their area. And this was actually in 1920. That wasn't even just outside of Russia. That was outside of anybody who could communicate with Moscow. Those people could stay in communication with Moscow. But anybody who couldn't communicate with Moscow, they were supposed to organize church life. And so they were taking these kinds of steps to preserve the life of the church and the faith of the people.